favorite pastimes or things to do when I'm bored or when I'm on vacation is to go to museums.
Ha! Nerd!
Don't hate, I'm a history teacher, it's what we do. Museums are great because they have all this evidence from the past, all these old artifacts and relics and things that give us a better look into time periods of old. It's the type of thing that I love doing. But you ever think about what museums actually are? They're storehouses of stolen stuff, or as we like to call it, swag. I mean, really, when you think about it, all these things were things that once belonged to somebody else that somebody found and took for themselves. In a lot of ways, that's theft. So how do you justify that theft? In this case, the people who own museums and the historians of the world would say, well, we're preserving history for years and years to come so that students like you can better understand the world and how it was before you lived in it. And I suppose in some ways that does hold up. And after all, time has passed and those people are no longer in ownership of that stuff. But what about actual theft? Is there any way in which we can actually justify stealing? And most of you would say no, because you know that stealing is morally wrong. So then how can you justify something like imperialism, which is literally the theft of land, of economy, and of resources? How did Europeans, during the age of imperialism, actually justify what they were doing? Well, there are actually 4 reasons in which European countries try to justify their actions of imperialism, to make it right and justify the fact that they are stealing from these lesser countries. In our last video, we unpacked the poem The White Man's Burden by Rudyard Kipling, which is one of the first justifications for imperialism. Let's break down what that means again. The white man's burden was a belief that Europeans had a responsibility to bring civilization and culture to the rest of the world. Simply put, Europeans and Western powers believed that they were technologically and culturally more civilized than the rest of the world, and because of that, they had a responsibility to bring those cultures to other places in the world. This remains a very arrogant and culturally insensitive worldview that was probably the most popular reason for imperialism. This is certainly a racially charged viewpoint that elevated white individuals above other civilizations and cultures around the world. And not only that, Europeans probably used the white man's burden to justify what they were doing because it made them feel good. It felt like they were doing a service to the rest of the world. But really what they were doing was violence and conquest under the guise of advancement. Many Europeans believed they had a moral obligation or duty to clean up the rest of the world, and that their enlightened and civilized styles could bring that to all the corners of the earth. It's not like these other civilizations were asking for European help. They were living their lives, going about their business, and were untouched by European civilizations. But when Europeans showed up because they had resources that they wanted, they were able to get those under the guise of bringing civilization to these cultures, even though all they were actually doing was taking. But it's not fair to say that all Westerners were racist and believed that they were supreme to everyone else and that they had this moral obligation. There's another reason why many believed they had to go into the world. The majority of Western individuals were in fact Christian, and they believed that through imperialism they were following the commands that Jesus Christ gave us in Matthew 28:19 to go into all the world and make disciples of all nations. So many imperialist adventures were actually a reflection of Christian missionary work, of the Great Commission, and were rather innocent in that. Take, for example, Dr. David Livingstone, who went into Africa with the sole intent of spreading the gospel to places that hadn't received it yet. However, many also tried to use the Christian worldview to justify literal expansion and taking over other places. This goes back to the 1400s when the Portuguese and the Spanish first began colonizing, and Pope Alexander VI had a declaration of discovery in which he said, yes, it is your God-given right to take all the lands out there that do not belong to you, because God wants you to expand and further his kingdom. Take, for example, in the United States, when Americans began expanding westward, it was under the guise of a term called manifest destiny, in which Americans believed that God had given them the entire continent, and he expected them to go and take it. We've seen many civilizations throughout world history who had the belief that they were the next version of the children of Israel, God's chosen people, and that because of that they had this license to do whatever they want, in this case, conquest, whether it was the Americans expanding with manifest destiny, or the British entering Africa, India, or China, or the Germans or the Belgians, whoever you think of, many of them had Christian ties and believed they were simply doing what God had called them to do. But our third justification for imperialism is not as Christian. In fact, it is more secular. Ever since the start of the Industrial Revolution, we have been discussing how the world has become more and more secular and is moving away from the church. Much of that is due to the increased public opinion and the belief of evolution. And as the ideas of Charles Darwin continue to spread into society, so do many of his views about how life should function. Darwin specifically upheld his ideas of natural selection, or survival of the fittest. The strongest species, or the ones who adapt the best, are able to survive. This idea quickly became a part of many views of society, which we call social Darwinism, when natural selection is applied to politics or general life or government or whatever. Social Darwinism will prove to be a very dangerous ideology because much like the way in which people were using the white man's burden, or even in some cases their ideas of Christianity, people begin to feel they have a license to do whatever they want in order to survive. Again, survival of the fittest holds that those who adapt the best or those who perform the best are the ones who actually survive. So as this is applied to things like politics or military or the economy, it creates a very cutthroat society. It's very easy to see why then this would be a justification for imperialism, because as we saw with the white man's burden, Europeans already believed that people in other parts of the world are inferior or weaker. So therefore, social Darwinism and natural selection holds that the Europeans should rule over them because they are stronger. This very quickly gives way to the violence and the conquest that you see in all these different places, whether it's Africa, Asia, or Latin and South America. Social Darwinism becomes one of the major driving forces behind imperialism worldwide. It allows countries to become, quote unquote, stronger and become more rich and more profitable, which allows them to continue to survive. At least that's what these people who believe in social Darwinism thought. Yet our fourth and final way in which imperialism was often justified was connected back to something that we've already talked about, and that is nationalism. Remember, nationalism is more than patriotism. It is an extreme love of your country, but also a belief that your country should be better than everyone else, and that in a lot of ways you need to prove that your country is better than anyone else. Well, how can you do that? Well, for one, you can acquire more swag. In this case, the more colonies and the more resources that you have, the more power you have over other countries, which would allow you to achieve your nationalist goals. During this time period, many countries around the world found themselves competing with others in order to show who was superior, and imperialism is a direct result of that. In many ways, imperialism allows these countries to truly show their competition, to show their spoils, and to show their muscle. And for new developing countries who wanted to be considered a world power like the rest of the world, imperialism gave them the chance to do that. For example, the United States was trying to find world power status, and one individual, Alfred Thayer Mahan, an admiral in the U.S. Navy, believed that the United States should grow its Navy to a point that it was unparalleled throughout the world. Having such a Navy gave the United States the tools it needed to compete for territories around the world in an imperialist setting, which is exactly what the United States did at the turn of the century in 1900 when it attacked Spain in the Spanish-American War. Very quickly, the United States gained control of territories like Cuba and the Philippines and was considered finally to be a world power, having achieved its nationalist goals. If you thought we were done with nationalism, this is just the start. Nationalism is at the root of so many different conflicts and issues worldwide throughout all of world history. And as nationalism and imperialism combine, we're only going to see the competition for supremacy between countries worldwide increase. So to recap, through the white man's burden, Christian missions, social Darwinism, and nationalism, Europeans attempted to justify their conquests and expansion into different developing places around the world. Now, just because they tried to justify it doesn't mean it actually was justified. With hindsight, we can see that there really isn't anything that justifies the violence and the conquest and the enslavement of all of these different peoples around the world. Yet Europeans were blinded by their goals, blinded by their ambitions, and convinced themselves in a way that what they were doing was actually right and in many cases necessary. No wonder that so many of these competing countries very quickly embrace imperialism because of what it gives them. It gives them power and it gives them ranking and status within the world. Again, tying imperialism very directly to nationalism. But as we know, there's only so much territory and so many resources in the world, and eventually these things are going to run out. And what'll happen when everything's gone? Again, that's a story for another time. We'll see you next time.